everybody! Today I wanted to do a non-spoilery review of Vicious by V.E. Schwab, aka Victoria Schwab. I picked this book up because it is the October read for the Little Book Club, which is Katrina over at Little Book Owl's book club on Goodreads. I'd sort of had it on my list for a little while but wasn't sure when I was going to get around to it, so I figured this was the perfect excuse. Vicious is an adult sci-fi, anti-hero, superhero, supervillain sort of book, and I loved it. I gave it 5 out of 5 stars on Goodreads. The basic premise of this book is that it takes place in modern day, and you follow 2 college seniors who are completely brilliant, named Eli and Victor. They take on this crazy thesis that's looking at the possibility of people being extraordinary, aka sort of like superheroes, and this project ends up completely changing their lives and starting a 10-year-long rivalry, and we're not exactly sure what went wrong to make that happen. Like I said, I don't want to get into spoilers, so I'm just going to point out the main 2 shticks of the book that I found really interesting. The first key factor is that this book is told in multiple timelines. There's a few different things that it jumps back and forth between, but the 2 main points that you see are present day and 10 years ago. Now, I personally really like multiple timelines because it kind of feels like you're piecing together this puzzle where you only have, bits of what you know happened at the beginning and bits of what you know happened at the end, but you don't know how it fits together and then how it's going to move forward. So I really liked that. But it is difficult to write. There are a couple of really tricky obstacles that I think she did a really good job of overcoming. The first tricky thing is, of course, balancing what we already know and what we don't know for each timeline and making sure that every chapter that you switch back and forth between complements one another, doesn't confuse us, and doesn't get repetitive. And she did that really, really well. I never felt like we were reading the same thing over and over again, and I never felt like one timeline was giving too much away about the other one. Like, it was paced really, really well. The other tricky thing is that since the 10 years ago timeline indicates that our characters do live for another 10 years after those events, you're probably not going to be as worried about them. You kind of already know where they end up. And so how do you build that suspense? How do you get the reader really enthralled with what's going on in that 10-year ago timeline? It just goes to show how good her writing is, that even though you know exactly pretty much what happens to them, you're still really invested and really worried about them every time you read those sections, or at least I was. I think props to her for that, because it's hard to make people really get anxious about, that sort of thing when they already sort of know what's going to happen. The other main thing about this book is that every single character is really, really flawed. Basically, you get 2 characters and a whole host of other side characters that are very, very gray. I really liked that. I haven't really read an anti-hero book before, and I thought it was really interesting and refreshing. If you look objectively at these characters, there's no way you could say that they are good people. All of them are sort of awful people, but they're not 100% awful. They do have their good moments, which never excuses the crappy things that they do, but it does make them really interesting, and it just gives them a lot of nuance, and it just makes you ask a lot of really big questions about morality and mortality and what it means to be a hero, what it means to be a good person, and showing how everyone is sort of the hero of their own story, regardless of what other people think. It just, it makes you ask a lot of those really cool questions, and I really liked how messed up every character was. It made them way more interesting. Also, just as a writer, it was kind of a good lesson in what you should think of when you're writing your villains, because you can obviously write straight up evil villains who are evil for the sake of it, but when you write characters more like Victor and Eli, who just seem like really terrible people, but when you're in their heads, you can kind of see where they're coming from almost. They're still terrible, but they're interesting, and they're clearly were made to be this way. And so I think it's really good to keep in mind if you're writing your own villains to create characters sort of like this. Characters that make sense, even though you can still love to hate them, but you can see the nuance there, you know what I mean? So yeah, in general, this book kept me guessing the whole time, because after you get up to the present day, you kind of get all caught up on the backstory, it then kind of moves forward and you're not sure, how are Eli and Victor going to end up going head to head and what's going to happen? And yeah, it really did keep me guessing the whole time. I was entertained the whole time. It was a real page turner. So 5 out of 5 stars on Goodreads for me for this book. That being said, I did want to look on Goodreads and just see if there were any common complaints of the people who really didn't like the book, and there were sort of 2 or 3 main things that I saw a few times. The first thing was that some people did think the characters were still too flat. I thought that they were pretty complex, but a lot of people were thinking that they were complex in a cliche sort of way, and that there wasn't still enough character development to justify the switch that happens at the pivotal point in the book in the main character's personalities. Some of them thought it was a bit of a stretch. So that was one kind of complaint, that the character development wasn't as solid as it could have been. Another thing was that some people were thinking the story was a little bit too self-aware self-aware and self-indulgent and how like awesome it was trying to be, which again, I didn't really notice, but that stuck out to a number of people, so a valid complaint, I suppose. As always though, I recommend that you read it and figure out your own opinions for yourself. I'd recommend this to any sci-fi lover or anyone in the mood for a quick sci-fi read, and anybody who's just looking for something a little bit different that's kind of fast-paced with really interesting characters. If you guys have read this book, I'd love to hear your comments about it down below, and if you haven't read this book, are you interested? What types of book like this have you read if you haven't read this one? Let me know. Yeah, that's it for me. So this has been I was gonna say a TBR. No, it is not. This has been a review. I'm Jackie, and I will see you in the next one. Bye. There is a tiny, tiny spider. Wow. Look at Janine. Look how tiny the spider is.
Some characters.
I was like, what is that little dust mote? It's a teeny widow spider.